See it. Hello, everybody. All right. I think we've got as many people as we're gonna get. I am recording this, so if somebody misses it, it'll be posted on my YouTube channel, and I can post it on social media as well. Um, if anyone wants to watch it later. So we're gonna go ahead and get started. Let me see, make sure that I got that all set up. Yep. Okay. Cool. Okay. Awesome. Each chapter begins with a either a poem or a um, uh, sort of like they call them Muggles maxims, um, like a phrase um, that Muggles, the main character, came up with. So the first one is a poem. Um, I love a good book with a map. So I just want to show really fast. I did print the map for this book. You can find it online. That's the one that was sort of the cover image for the video. But good maps in this book. There's two maps in this book, which is exciting. So this is the Gammage Cup by Carol Kendall. Sorry, Carol Kendall. The reason that I'm reading it, for anyone who's not aware, I think I said on all the social media posts I did, but my sixth grade teacher, who was like my favorite teacher, who made me want to be a teacher, and really the reason that I teach middle school now, I teach seventh grade. She passed away last month. And this was the book that she read. She read lots of books to us in class, but this was the one book that she read to like every single class. It's The Gammage Cup by Carol Kendall. It's called A Novel of the Mini Pins. And so I figured, sort of in her honor, um, I couldn't really put into words what I wanted to say about her and like how meaningful she was in my life. So I figured I'll just read the book that she read us. So, this is The Gammage Cup, Chapter 1. In the land far off of the land outside, brave Minipins lived, and some of them died. Lost are their treasures, buried deep. Till the dry time came and the world was sand, then Minipins fled to a wetter land. Lost are their treasures, in the ground they sleep. And nobody knew that the Minipins went to the land of the river, where they live content. Lost are their treasures, and the secrets they keep. Gummy, scribbles, collected works. It was quite untrue that the Minipins, or small ones, were a lost people, for they knew exactly where they were. They dwelt along the banks of the Watercress River in the land between the mountains, where they fished and tended their famous watercress beds and grew their own peculiar reeds, which could be milled into flour or used for hatching, or pulped into paper or woven into cloaks of moth-wing softness. It was a snug and secure valley, completely surrounded by unclimbable mountains, so perfectly made for stay-at-home, peace-loving Minipins that it was no wonder they were to be found there. There were 12 villages in all, starting with Watersplash at the very head of the valley, where the freshets formed down the cliffs of the old Snowdrift Mountain, and ending with Water Gap, where the waters of the river roared through the very heart of the craggy mountain known as Frostbite. It was through this tunnel in Frostbite, according to legend, that the only remaining Minipins on Earth had traveled, under their leader Gammage, to reach the Green Valley in those old, far-off days of the Great Dry Time. The river was a mere muddy trickle then, like all the rivers of the land. It was said, by Walter the Earl, who made a study of such things from a few old moldy parchments in his possession, that the Minipins were running for their lives from a savage band known as the Mushrooms, or the Hairless Ones, when they entered the long tunnel, yanking their two-wheeled carts after them. They were only saved from being spitted and roasted for the mushrooms' dinner by a miraculous rain, which filled the riverbed after they had come through the tunnel and washed out their pursuers. Once the river closed the underground passage, there was no way in or out of the land between the mountains, except for high-flying birds and Fooly the balloonist, of course. But Fooly came along sometime later, and Fooly was special. One of the 12 villages was Slipper on the Water, which got its name, so the legend went on, when those first Minipins paddled their rudely made boats up the watercress to explore their new valley. It was at this spot that Gammage lost his left slipper overboard. For 3 days and 3 nights, it floated on the water in the self-same spot, never moving with the current. Clearly, this was a symbol not to be ignored. So it was that 10 of the mini pins never got to the head of the valley at all. They stayed at Slipper on the Water, building their cottages of river clay and reed thatch, establishing their watercress beds, and raising their small families. But before Gammage and the others traveled on to found other villages along the watercress, each of the 10 drank deeply from the precious cup of wisdom that Gammage carried, wrapped in silk and slung over his shoulder. So much and no more was known of the far past, for no real records had been kept during the early ages. At least none had ever been discovered, though Walter the Earl was convinced that they existed. His several fragments of ancient parchment hinted, he said, nobody else could decipher the old writing, of treasures buried in the village, possibly in his own garden. His cottage had the oldest foundation of any in Slipper on the Water, and was believed to have been the first meeting house in the village. So Walter the Earl dug up his garden and probed at the walls of his house in search of ancient scrolls and treasures, and occasionally buttonholed folks to talk about historical facts, while more sensible minipins worked at their practical jobs, and, when they thought of Walter the Earl at all, considered him a dry old bore. Now, in this, the year of Gammage 880, though Slipper on the Water had the usual river clay cottages with reed thatch, lived in by the usual minipins and minipin children, it was by no means an ordinary village. For one thing, there were those few villagers known as the periods. Periods were special. Everyone agreed to that. Not only did they have a special way of spelling their names, but they wore a special air of dignity. And of course, they held most of the village offices. It had been this way in Slipper on the Water ever since the time of Fooley the balloonist. For the periods were the descendants of Fooley, and that explained everything as far as the villagers were concerned. It was just 440 years ago that Fooley, afterwards known as Fooley the Magnificent or the Great Fooley, had sailed over the cliffs of Snowdrift in a balloon of reed silk and woven willow. The first, last, and only balloon ever constructed in the land between the mountains. Even more miraculous to ground loving minipins, he had sailed back just 129 days later, bringing with him a case full of curiosities from the land beyond the mountains. But as though to underline the moral that mini pins were meant to stay at home, the balloon contraption had burst when he landed, scattering its contents, including Fooley, over several mini pin acres of ground. When Fooley was picked up, he had no recollection of what he had seen in the land beyond the mountains. If it hadn't been for the curiosities and the queer books he had filled with notes, Fooley would in time have become a misty legend, and Slipper on the Water only number 10 of the 12 very ordinary mini pin villages spread along the banks of the watercress. But as it was, the periods, descendant of that long ago adventurer, were special. Though many pins in general never strayed far from their homes, always excepting the mayors of the villages, who once a year made the long trip to Watersplash for the big meeting. The fame of these descendants had gone up and down the valley. Periods were like that. But it wasn't only the periods who made Slipper on the Water different. There were 3 mini pins in the village who were usually referred to by their neighbors as, oh, them. They were not considered respectable. They were a law amongst themselves. They lived alone instead of marrying and raising families, as normal minipins did. Worst of all, they flaunted cloaks of such an outlandish hue that it was shaming to be seen talking to them. Furthermore, the thems didn't properly work at anything. Walter the Earl spent his time digging holes in the ground in his ridiculous search for hidden treasure. Curly Green was usually to be seen sitting on her stool in the corner of the marketplace, blobbing pictures onto stretched reed paper. And Gummy was bone idle. Gummy was never seen doing anything but wearing a dreamy look along with his sun-colored cloak and peaked hat. He disappeared for hours at a time in his tiny boat, but where he went and what he did, nobody knew, though there were rumors aplenty. Only 2 things were surely known about Gummy. He was overfond of childish pranks, and he made rhymes. Not proper poems, such as the ones brought back by Fooley, now hanging in the museum, but scribbles. Nonsense rhymes about rain and birds and flowers and the wind, and they bubbled out of him as water bubbles from a spring. Then, of course, there was Muggles. Muggles couldn't be called one of them exactly, but she wasn't just an ordinary villager either. While it was true that she dutifully wore the mini pin green cloak and brown weave dress, it cannot be denied that upon occasion she tied up her middle with a vivid orange sash. Besides being the caretaker of the Foley curiosities in the museum, she was a candy maker, which was a good, steady sort of thing to be. But on the other hand, she distressed the tiny Minipin housewives by keeping her house in a deplorable muddle. She was a collector of odds and ends and bits and pieces. Another good trait, but they overflowed her tiny cottage until it was next to impossible to step inside, and that was disgraceful. There had been complaints, of course, and only last year the mayor himself had begged her to tidy up like a good mini pin. Ever anxious to please, Muggles had tried hard, but the more she put away, the less able she was to find anything. Gradually, the articles she had neatly folded into cupboards slipped back into their old places on the floor, closets disgorged their precise piles of oddments, and drawers leaked their contents, until once more Muggles knew exactly where everything was. So, Muggles was something of a trial to Slipper on the Water, but it was agreed that there was no real harm in her. She was always ready to oblige, always in a good humor, and if she was a little simple minded, why, she could hardly be blamed for that. Being simple minded never interfered with her candy recipes or the job she had been given at the museum. The museum! Muggles awoke with the panicky feeling that she had overslept. She shot out of bed like a surfacing trout and then stood blinking in the chill half light of her little room. How very odd, she thought in her sleep fogged mind. How very odd that it is still so dark. What can have happened to the sun? Groping her way to the window, which overlooked the marketplace, she peered anxiously through the slatted reed shade. There had been rain during the night, for the cobblestones gleamed wet in the dim flare of the reed light still burning fitfully in the center of the marketplace. But why was the sun so late in appearing? Today, of all days, when the mayor was coming home from the big meeting. Still convinced that she had overslept, Muggles stood winking and blinking at the deserted cobblestones. Where had everyone got to? Why wasn't the square full of green cloaked figures hustling and bustling about to make ready for the mayor's return? Then, with a sigh of relief, she saw a line of golden fire on top of the Sunset Mountains in the west. Why, the sun must just be rising. Only, there's something wrong about that too, wasn't there? Suddenly she heard the pat pat of soft woven slippers on the cobblestones of the square. Rubbing her blurred eyes, she made out the figure of Gummy, one of them. He was coming from the street going to the river and stumbling across the marketplace as though he had just gotten off a dizzy swing at the fun fair. His yellow cloak drooped from his shoulders and his peaked hat looked wilted. In the middle of the marketplace, he stopped and stared up at the orange fire on the mountains for several moments before he staggered on. Muggles watched him going toward his own shabby cottage. Then he stopped again and veered to the right. A moment later, he had gone into Walter the Earl's house. Muggles blinked and stared and blinked again. Odder and odder. The reed light continued to flicker, casting its weird shadows over the cottages around the square and the four public buildings in the center. The door through which Gummy had gone opened once more, and he came out, this time accompanied by Walter the Earl, his gold-embroidered cloak slung over his shoulders. They both looked up at the Sunset Mountains, but now the fire had disappeared. While Muggles was pondering this further oddity, Gummy and Walter the Earl moved back toward Walter the Earl's house, where they spent some minutes inspecting the mounds of earth in the garden. Finally, Gummy trudged off to his cottage, and Walter the Earl picked up a spade and plunged it into the ground in a spot close to the house itself. And still the reed light flickered eerily over the wet cobblestones of the empty marketplace. Muggle stumbled back to her bed, struggling to make sense of this very queer morning. It was not until her feet grew toasty warm under the comforter that the explanation occurred to her. What a ninny I am, she thought with a drowsy laugh. It's not that the sun's late, it's me that's early. I was having a dream. I might have known when I saw the sun rising in the west that it was a dream, but what a queer dream to have. And it seemed so real. Yawning mightily, she snuggled deeper into her feathered bed and let sleep creep back into her body. Meanwhile, the sun rose quite properly from behind the Sunset Mountains in the east, dispelling the light mist in the valley. The lamplighter extinguished the reed light, snuffing hungrily at the yeasty aroma from Loaf the baker's ovens, and the village stirred to life. When the sun's rays finally touched Muggles' face, her eyes snapped open like window blinds suddenly released. She had overslept. There had been a sort of dream about oversleeping, she remembered fuzzily, and now she really had done it. Biting off a yawn, she floundered out of the jumble of comforters and pillows and began reaching here and there for her clothes, which she always left, for convenience's sake, on the floor. There was no time for a bath, which was just as well since her little bathing tub was full of odds and ends that had not yet found their way to a permanent keeping place. A place for everything, and the more things in the place, the better, Muggles murmured to herself, for there was nobody else to talk to. She paused in her dressing operation to cast a sharp glance around the room, just to reassure herself that nothing had leapt out of one pile and into another during the night. But it was all in perfect order, neat and tidy the way she liked it. The far corner pile, the hearthstone pile, the under the table pile. Muggles came to with a start. Idle dreamers have nothing to put in the pot, she told herself sharply. But she had a curious feeling that today was different from other days, that the very air she breathed was full of strange excitement, that something not altogether pleasant was about to happen. Nonsense, she scoffed, reaching for her slipper. There'll be a strange excitement, not altogether pleasant indeed, if I don't get over to that museum pretty soon. And the mayor coming home and all. She slipped her fat little feet into her slippers and gave the points on the toes a jerk to make them stand upright. It's what comes of dreaming silly dreams about suns coming up in the west where they've no right to be, that's all. Next, I'll be dreaming that there are real fires on the Sunset Mountains, and then where will we all be? She struggled into her brown weave dress and looked around for her brown sash, but it had somehow lost itself. No matter, today was a special day. With the mayor coming home from Water Splash, it was a day for a cheerful sash. She plunged her hand into the corner cupboard and unearthed the orange streamer that she saved for big events. Putting it around her middle, she tied it tightly, letting the ends tumble down the front. There was no time for breakfast, so she delved into the far corner pile, down past a box containing 5 magic pebbles, the pot of a new healing ointment concocted from 15 herbs and willow bark, a packet of glitter stones, a length of orange cloth she had dyed herself, a jar of poppy seeds, a green hat with a hole in the top, 1 mitten for the left hand, and 2 ribbons, a little woven reed basket, from which she extracted one of the 5 packets of peppermints. Then, throwing her green cloak around her shoulder, she opened the door and stepped out into the sunshine and bustle of the marketplace. The cobblestone square looked newly washed from the night's rain. Muggles frowned in sudden remembrance of her dream, then shook her head impatiently. Today, minipins of all ages were scurrying about the marketplace, green cloaks flying in the breeze. Round, rosy housewives, their brown weave dresses tucked up, were scrubbing their doorstones or polishing the silver doorknobs of their watercress green doors, while children were watering the flowers that grew around the family tree. Down the street going to the river, Muggles could see the town clerk's bald head shining as he strung up welcome garlands over the dock, while Mingy the money keeper stood at the bottom of the ladder and glared at him. The lines of one of Gummy's scribbles, which the children had gotten a hold of and liked to chant, ran through Muggles' head. Oh, Mingy was stingy, so everyone said, with gold in his closet and under his bed. Oh, Mingy was stingy, or so I've been told. He never did aught but count out his gold. Oh, Mingy was stingy, 'tis said often enough. I'd say it myself, believed I that stuff. She was immediately ashamed of herself, but Gummy's scribbles had a way of jingling round in one's head. It was then that Muggles did the first of many strange things. Late as she was, she turned and started back around the marketplace instead of crossing directly to the museum. I'm being foolish, she scolded herself, but she kept right on going. She slowed as she passed Gummy's shabby cottage, but there was no sign of him. Well, what had she expected? And if she had seen him, what then? She could hardly stop and ask him if he by any chance remembered being in her dream. The doorknob on his scuffed door needed polishing. Muggles noted with disapproval, and then remembered that she had forgotten to polish her own that morning. Neither was Curly Green to be seen. Muggles came to a full stop to gaze at the door, which was as scarlet as Curly Green's cloak and blazed in the morning sunlight like a bright welcome smile. What it would be like to live behind a door like that. Not that Muggles ever would, she assured herself quickly. Green was the only proper color for doors, but all the same, it would be exciting to be invited through a scarlet door someday. It was rumored in the village that not only did Curly Green refuse to paint real paintings, such as that brought back by Fooley, but that she actually blobbed pictures on the walls of her house. Of course, it was probably just gossip, but all the same. The scarlet door suddenly swung open, and Muggles found herself smiling directly into Curly Green's blue eyes that always seemed to be faintly mocking. She gave a little gasp and began to move on. Good morning, Muggles, Curly Green called. Were you looking for me? Her scarlet cloak was flung carelessly over her sky blue dress, and her light silky hair blew about her face like milkweed fluttering in a breeze. Under one arm, she carried the box of paints that always went with her. Muggles paused uncertainly. Good, good morning. I was just. Won't you? Would you like a peppermint? Thank you. Curly Green transferred her paint box to her other hand and dipped into the crumpled bag that Muggles proffered. Muggles helped herself from the bag, and they both stood there, solemnly sucking on the creamy bits and looking shyly at each other. Why, she looks nice, Muggles thought with surprise. Sort of, well, as though you could tell her things. I was looking at your door, Muggles burst out. I hope you don't mind. That is, your door, well, it sort of smiled at me? She stopped in confusion. It was saying just this kind of thing that made people laugh at her. She looked timidly at Curly Green. I don't expect that makes good sense. A door smiling, does it? Why ever not? Curly Green said. Have you ever noticed how the mayor's door frowns? Muggles laughed a little nervously, for nobody ever made jokes about anybody as important as the mayor, who was a period. Have another peppermint, do, she urged. They moved off toward the museum, crossing the small road going nowhere. Muggles paused to look, not at the scurrying figures along the road, but at the distant sunset mountains, hazed in a smoky mist. I wonder what they're really like, the mountains, she said, remembering her strange dream. She would have liked to tell Curly Green about the fiery light on the mountains, but dreams lost their wonder when you told them. You had to keep on saying, well, I can't just describe just the way it was, but, or, well, then suddenly I wasn't in the same place at all, only I can't explain how I got somewhere else. No, dreams were not for telling. Curly Green shifted her paint box to the other arm. Gummy says they're full of gold mines, like a honeycomb almost. And there's a little waterfall that dashes down. That's where the little trickle comes from. And the top of the cliff is so high and so straight that you think it will fall over on you when you look up. Gold mines. That's right, Curly Green said matter of factly. Silver, too, probably. Walter the Earl says Minipins used to be great miners. Someday he is going with Gummy to see the old mines. She stared off into the distance, where a bluish haze capped the crags of the Sunset Mountains. I think perhaps I should like to go with them, she added slowly. Muggles pressed a hand to her forehead to still the whirring motion inside. To talk so calmly about going into the wilds, beyond the safety of the village, out of sight of houses and green cloaks and the old familiar cobblestones of the marketplace? Gold and silver mines. What was a mine like? And how did Gummy know so much about the mountains? She turned suddenly to Curly Green as a fearful thought struck her. You don't mean... Has Gummy been there? She asked in a hushed whisper. Curly Green's blue eyes mocked her. Of course. How else would he know about the mines? I really should be at the museum, Muggles thought in a panic. I shouldn't be mixing myself up with them. Gold and silver mines, waterfalls, cliffs that might fall down, digging holes to find old treasure. She caught hold of Curly Green's free hand. Oh, please don't even think of going, she begged. Terrible things might happen. You mustn't ever go off from the village. It's not safe at all, you know. But Gummy goes, said Curly Green with great calm. He's built himself a little house on the little trickle up near the mountains. A house? Whatever for? Asked Muggles. He's got a house right here where a house should be. Curly Green just looked at her. Well, now he has two houses. The other one is made of stone, he says, and it has a front door and a back door, though I suspect the reason for that is that he got tired of carrying stones and found it easier to make a second door. Someday he's promised to take me there. She turned to gaze at the Sunset Mountains. You could go too if you liked, she added. Oh, no, I couldn't. I wouldn't, cried Muggles, shrinking away. And I really must be off now. The museum, the mayor's homecoming, it's been nice talking to you, but some other time. And she began to hurry on across the road, past Walter the Earl's cottage with its unsightly mounds all around it. Even as she passed, a shovelful of dirt landed on the top of the newest mound and sprinkled down its sides. Digging holes produces nothing but holes, Muggles thought severely and hurried a little faster. Behind her, the unseen Walter the Earl plopped another shovelful of dirt on the heap. The museum was one of the 4 public buildings in the marketplace. Like any proper Minipin building, it was made of white painted clay and thatched with reed. And of course, it had a watercress green door. But over that door, so that nobody could mistake it for a mere cottage, was lettered in the official village painter's neatest script, Foley Museum. Now we get to do, again, I was talking about this at the beginning, but I have to show you the village painter and what he writes. So I'm going to go ahead and uncover one of these for you. All right. So we start off up here with Foley Museum. All right. So, in the second corner was a building just like it, except that the script read, this time, Foley Hall Meeting House. The third building, exactly like the other two, said House of the Mayor. And the fourth building was labeled Supplies. And you can see there how supplies is spelled. The official village painter sometimes made errors in spelling, but since he was a descendant of Foley the Magnificent, nobody liked to call attention to his mistakes, and Supplies, Supplys, the general store, remained. Muggles reached the museum and pushed open the watercress green door. Only then did she look back to where she had left Curly Green, but Curly Green appeared to have forgotten all about her. She was standing on top of the fresh pile of dirt, talking to Walter the Earl. Or rather, he was talking and pointing in the direction of the Sunset Mountains. Then he took a spade and slid down the mound out of sight, but Curly Green still stood there, gazing into the distance. With a shiver of apprehension, Muggles slipped into the peaceful silence of the museum. There were lots of reasons why Walter the Earl might be pointing to the mountains, she told herself. It had nothing to do with her dream. She went quickly around the four walls, opening lattice blinds and letting the air in through the windows. A bar of sunlight fell across the Gammage slipper on the pedestal in the middle of the room. It showed a thin film of dust on the ancient brown leather. Clicking her tongue against the roof of her mouth, Muggles hurried over and blew vigorously. Dust motes danced in the air, then slowly began to settle once more. With a guilty look behind her, Muggles lifted the precious slipper off its green cushion and rubbed it with one end of her orange sash. The Gammage slipper was the most venerated object in the land between the mountains, always excepting the Gammage Cup, of course, but that was kept at Watersplash, where Gammage had carried it 880 years ago. And though folk all up and down the Watercress River yearned to drink of its wisdom, at Watersplash the cup remained. Even the mayor of Slipper on the Water, with his persuasive ways, had failed to convince the Council of the 12 Mayors that the Gammage Cup belonged in Slipper on the Water, where there was a museum to house it properly. Reverently replacing the slipper on its green cushion, Muggles next looked to Foley's balloon, although there was not much of it left to arrange. The woven willow basket had been mended and remended by Crambo the basket maker and Crambo's father and grandfather before him, but the strong reed silk that had once ballooned over Foley's head was tattered with age. Muggles dusted it by the simple expedient of blowing on it as hard as she could. Then she turned to the table that held Foley's book. This tindery volume she opened with careful fingers to the page which the mayor liked best. He was the most direct descendant of Foley the Magnificent, being the eldest son of the eldest son of the eldest son, and so on back to the eldest son of Foley himself. The page held a list of strange words neatly printed in Foley's hand. Until the day of his death, Foley could never remember what the words meant, but his wife was sure that they were the names of friends he had made in the land beyond the mountains. Very distinguished and special looking the names were too, all with periods after them. And now I will show you the names, which are back here. All right, so this is what that list looks like. So Foley's wife proceeded to have a batch of children instead of the usual 2 to a family, and to each child she gave one of the distinguished names, including the period, of course. Nobody could ever mistake a descendant of Foley the Magnificent for an ordinary minipin. Some of the ordinary minipins, who were perhaps envious, said you could not only never mistake them, you couldn't even pronounce them. Foley's wife retorted that it only took a bit of imagination. She got Foley when he was an old man sitting idle in the sun to print out a second list beside the first list. Muggles carefully wiped the dust off the book with her orange sash, and then, as she did every morning, read down the 2 lists. So here's the second list. All right. Sorry, my light is obscuring it a little bit, but I'll go ahead and read it. So the first line there, litted to rhyme with fitted, co, bros, whim, geo, eng, scot, ect, rit, rid, sta, Ave, and then that last one is 4 question marks. Since Foley's day, the names had been used over and over again for his grandchildren, his great grandchildren, and their great grandchildren, but none of them was ever called this one because nobody, not even Foley's wife, could think how to pronounce it. It must be grand, Muggles often thought, to have one of those names and see it written there in the book. But today, there was no time for idle vaporings. She marched across the room to set the painting straight. It always went crooked when the door opened or shut. Okay, we got another illustration for you. There are less illustrations coming up in the book, but this just kind of here at the beginning, there's a lot. So this painting, oh, I'm upside down. That's not helpful. This painting here, if you cannot see it, this picture here is labeled painting. Sorry, the painting. And this picture here is labeled family tree, which is going to be important in a moment. Okay. Of all the curiosities that had been pitched out of Foley's balloon, the painting was the only one that had fallen into the Watercress River. When it had been fished out, nobody knew what it was, but fortunately, Foley had listed in his book the names of the curiosities, and when everything else was checked off, like the family tree, the poem, the hourglass, it was obvious that the remaining item was a painting. The bath in the watercress had done it no good. Though the colors of the squares, triangles, circles, and shields were clear enough, and the interconnecting black lines intact, the piece of parchment looked as though inky fingers had daubed it. But daubs or no daubs, the periods, and therefore the ordinary villagers, adopted the painting for their own. Ever since Foley's time, a painting was a pattern of colored shapes connected by black lines, following the classical example. Had it not been for the children and Curly Green, who persisted in making pictures of scenes or things or people instead of precise patterns, the older art would have been lost entirely. Muggles had long ago given up on trying to understand the painting. That was for the clever periods. So after flicking it with the ends of her sash, she moved on to the family tree hanging on the same wall. There you go. It was strange to think that before Foley made his balloon voyage, there wasn't a tree in the whole village. Trees were for forests, not villages, just as houses were for villages, not forests. But when Foley returned with the picture of a great willow growing in front of a house, the idea of a family tree in every garden had taken firm root with the Minipins. Such was the planting fever in Foley's time that today there wasn't a cottage inn slipper on the water without a fine willow growing in front of it. And a fine willow is a fine thing, Muggles murmured to herself. There's nothing like willow for an ailment, whether it's a cut hand or a stomachache or bad dreams. Bad dreams. Her dream of the morning, which had been crouching at the back of her head, leapt suddenly sharp and clear into her mind. The line of orange fire on the mountains, Gummy pointing to it, Walter the Earl plunging his spade into the ground. But Walter the Earl really had plunged his spade into the ground, in the self-same spot she had seen in her dream, for there it was that the new hole was dug. And he too had pointed to the mountains to show Curly Green. Show her what? Nonsense, she scoffed, and gave the family tree an angry flick of her sash. It's that Gummy's fault. Folks stay decently at home in their beds, and other folk wouldn't dream about them. Then she stood quite still. What if, just supposing, of course, it wasn't possible, but what if it hadn't been a dream? What if the light she had seen this morning had been fires on the mountain? But that was more nonsense. How could there be fires on the Sunset Mountains? Scarcely aware of what she was doing, Muggles walked out the door of the museum and across the cobblestones to Walter the Earl's house. Curly Green was sitting with her back against the willow tree, facing the cottage. Against her drawn-up knees, she held a big strip of birch bark, which she was dabbing with her paintbrush. But the blob she was painting was not the scene before her. The white clay cottage with its green door, the mound of fresh earth beside it. She was painting instead, but Muggles had only the briefest glimpse of the blob before Curly Green, hearing her step, flipped it over and held it suspended between her fingers. What Muggles thought she saw was her dream. Surely that had been the marketplace, wet and glistening in the expiring flicker of the reed light, Gummy lurching across the cobblestones, and High above the village in the black distance, tongues of orange flame licking the top of the Sunset Mountains. "You've come back," said Curly Green. "Yes, I wanted to talk to Walter the Earl. He's not very talkative this morning." With great care, Curly Green propped the birch bark against the trunk of the willow, with the picture facing in. Muggles swallowed the dryness out of her throat. The that picture. Could I see it?" Curly Green jerked her head up. But just then they heard a clanking, huffing, scrambling sound that made them both swing around and look at the dirt heap. There was a muffled exclamation, and a moment later a toiling figure emerged from the pit beyond the mound, hauling an iron box behind him. It was Walter the Earl. Dirt encrusted his thick eyebrows, and rivulets of perspiration streaked his long, stern nose. He stood commandingly on top of the mound, straddling the iron box, and blinked into the bright sunlight. Then, seeing Curly Green and Muggles below him, he smiled, a slow, triumphant smile. He raised a solemn hand, and his voice rang into the sunlit morning. "I have found the ancient treasure!" Chapter 2. From out of the then and into the now, from the there to the here, come the why and the how. Gummy, Scribbles, Collected Works. The ancient treasures! Muggles felt the blood pound in her head. Curly Green glanced swiftly around the marketplace, but no one was looking their way. "Better get that out of sight," she warned. "There are noses in the village as sharp as needles, and if you don't want it taken away from you before you've even looked at it—" "And that isn't all," Walter the Earl was going on. "There are boxes and boxes—" He stopped abruptly. "You're right, Curly Green. Not a word must be said." He frowned down at Muggles. "What about her?" Curly Green hesitated, and then, her eyes on Muggles' orange sash, said, "She's all right. Aren't you, Muggles?" Muggles stared numbly from one to the other. I'm all right," she said in a husky whisper, hardly aware that she was committing herself to anything. "Come and see for yourselves." Walter the Earl beckoned them to follow, and, taking hold of the iron box, slid from sight down into the pit. Clambering to the top of the mound behind Curly Green, Muggles gazed into the hole with astonishment. It went deep, deep as a room is high, but the most surprising thing about it was the solid wall of stones which it exposed, foundation stones far beneath the cottage. At the bottom of the pit were pieces of rock which Walter the Earl had chipped out of the wall just above, making an opening large enough to crawl through. "In here!" came Walter the Earl's hollow voice from the opening. They skidded down into the hole, and Curly Green slipped through the aperture with ease, but Muggles almost got stuck and had to wriggle herself free. She emerged into a dim, chill stone chamber, lighted by a single candle which Walter the Earl had struck on the floor. Iron boxes lined the walls to the wood ceiling. Iron boxes were stacked in the center of the floor. Iron boxes were everywhere the eye looked. "But what is in them?" asked Curly Green. "Are they really the treasure?" Walter the Earl tapped the small chest he had dragged with him. "This contains ancient scrolls. As for the rest, we'll have to see." He pushed at the lid of the iron box nearest him. It didn't move. Snatching up a bar of iron lying on the floor, he pried at the lid. With a screech and a groan, it slowly opened. Curly Green snatched up the candle and, with Muggles, leaned over to see the contents of the chest. "But it's just old black pieces of iron," Muggles cried in dismay. Walter the Earl reached in and picked up one of the objects. "A knife!" exclaimed Curly Green. "But what a big one! Why would anyone want such a big knife?" Walter the Earl thoughtfully ran his fingers down the flat of the long blade. It was ugly and black and heavy, set in plain haft that fitted snugly in his hand. He held the long knife out at arm's length and made a sudden slash with it. Muggles shrieked and jumped back. "It's a wicked thing!" she cried. "And so it should be, for killing wicked enemies." Walter the Earl drew his brows together in concentration. "But somehow I am disappointed. I thought it would have been more beauty, and the edge seems dull." "Oh, do put it away," Muggles pleaded. "We're not enemies. There aren't any enemies in the land between the mountains. Put it away, Walter the Earl, before someone is hurt." And she wrung her hands. "That's what folks have been repeating for a great many years," said Walter the Earl absently, "and so they regard it as fact." He gave a snort of disgust. "Fact! What do they know about fact? However, He looked fondly at the ugly black blade, and his voice became brisk. It wants cleaning. Can you make me one of your polishes, my good muggles? I must set to work to clean this knife. Curly Green tugged impatiently at the lid of another box. What do you suppose is in the rest of these? Easily discovered, said Walter the Earl. He inserted the end of his crowbar beneath the lid and pried up to the top. At, as the light of the candle glinted on the contents, Muggles gasped and fell back. Bodies! Oh, close the lid, quick! This is a horrible thing you have found. But Walter the Earl lifted out the topmost object, a terrible metallic head with a snout and enormous blue and gold plumes blossoming at the top. Even as he handled it, the snout clicked open, as though the head would speak, and Walter the Earl all but dropped it in fright. Curly Green shook so that the candle almost went out. Is it... What is it? Oh, don't put it on. It might be magic. She was too late. Walter the Earl slipped the horrible hollow mask over his own head. Take it off, Muggles cried, retreating toward the opening. Take it off before... Curly Green began to laugh. A shaky little laugh, but heartening in the flickering gloom of the damp vault. You look like a fish. Walter the Earl put his hands up to the snout of the helmet and pushed it up onto his forehead. Hand me some of those other pieces in the chest. I think I know what they're for. Curly Green gingerly plucked a clanking metal leg from the box, then another, and laid them on the floor. To the heap, she added 2 jointed arms and finally a body piece. When she and Muggles had helped Walter the Earl into the surprisingly light metal garments, he was transformed into a terrible creature, but when he moved, he squeaked in all directions. Muggles clapped her hands to her ears. You need oiling. Walter the Earl nodded with satisfaction. And polishing. You can see that it will be bright as the sun once it's cleaned. He cast another puzzled look at the dull black knife. Queer, he muttered. They set to work more quickly, shifting boxes about and prying open the lids. There were more of the knives and the metal bodies. There were scarlet and gold banners. There were large flat pieces of metal with wrist straps in the middle. And then Muggles drew back the top of a chest whose contents glittered and flashed. Cloaks, but more splendid cloaks than any she could have imagined. With trembling fingers, she took one out and held it up for the others to see. Woven of gold thread and encrusted with twinkling red and green and white stones, it was a cascade of colored fire in the dark vault. Muggles caught her breath. But do you think anybody ever wore these? They're not... They don't look like mini pin cloaks. Ordinary ones, that is, she added quickly with a sidelong glance at the others. Walter the Earl took the cloak from her and put it stiff, crackling folds about his shoulders. A second and third he drew from the box and draped around Muggles and Curly Green. Then he snatched up the long black knife and waved it in an arc above his head. Advance the host, he cried. Death to the enemy! Muggles gave a shudder. I wish you wouldn't do things like that. The mayor won't like this, Curly Green said. Lytted doesn't like anything that happened before Fooley, replied Walter the Earl. The mayor has river water running in his veins instead of blood. Tell me this, and he scowled fiercely at them from under the visor of his helmet. Has it ever occurred to you that if Fooley could leave this valley in a balloon, then it is possible for enemies to enter the valley in the same way? But Fooley was different, Muggle stammered, frightened again. Nobody else knows how to make a balloon, do they? How do we know what folks do or do not know outside the land between the mountains? What facts do you have on the subject? Retorted Walter the Earl. How do you know that a great force is not assembled this very minute to descend on us, as though we're fish in Finn's fishing tank at the fair? Muggles could feel her legs begin to tremble. The fires on the mountains. That's what I... You're frightening Muggles, Curly Green said. She was rummaging in a box that contained strange, long, golden tubes ending in flaring edges, like trumpet flowers. Puzzled, she examined a trumpet flower, and then tilted the tube to look in the other end. Was one supposed to blow into it? It is time someone in this sleepy valley was frightened, Walter the Earl began fiercely, just as Curly Green put the golden tube to her mouth and blew with all her might. The fearful blast exploded against the 4 walls. Muggles shrieked, and Walter the Earl staggered back, fell over a box, and landed on the floor in a din of clanking, squeaking metal. What was that? He stammered. I don't know. Curly Green held the golden tube toward him. It looked as though it should be blown, so I blew into it. Do you want to try? No, Muggles begged, her hands over her ears. You'll bring everybody in the village running to see. Walter the Earl nodded approvingly as he took the golden tube into his hands. I wonder, he mused, is it some sort of music pipe? Music, Muggle said with a snort. Nobody could hear it without running all the way to the Sunset Mountains. Ah, you have hit upon it, my good Muggles. This, then, is something to frighten the enemy. He looked at her with respect. Muggles felt herself going pink with pleasure. Perhaps, she said hopefully, perhaps the ancient scrolls will tell us about these things. The trumpet flower and the long knives and the metal suits and everything. Excellent thought, Walter the Earl exclaimed. Then he looked around blankly. But where is the little box? You're leaning against it, said Curly Green. So I am. Walter the Earl swiveled awkwardly in his metal suit to get at the small chest. More light, if you please, my dear Curly Green. She brought the candle closer, and the three of them bent over the chest. Walter the Earl threw back the lid. Scroll upon scroll lay inside, yellow with age, their ribbons faded. Reverently, he picked up the top scroll and untied the ribbon. The parchment crackled as he unrolled it and held it under the light. Muggles stared blankly at the queer scribbles that filled the page, but Walter the Earl nodded. It's the old writing, he said, like the fragments that have been handed down through my family. Yes, yes, Curly Green said hastily, for everybody knew all about the ancient settler who had written an account of how the Minipins had fled from the mushrooms through the tunnel into the land between the mountains. But do read this to us. Yes. Walter the Earl wrinkled up his forehead and bent his stern nose to the task. Be it known, that this, yes, it is very difficult hand to read, but I think, yes, here we are. Be it known that this chest of scrolls and all the other chests of armor, swords, shields, trumpets, battle flags, and war cloaks, which were brought to the land between the mountains by the great leader Gammage, and left in the care of one of my forebearers, were sealed into this vault of the old meeting house by Walter the 17th Earl in the year of Gammage 480, there to rest until somebody is once again interested in the glorious history of the Minipins. It is 40 years since the fool returned from his balloon ride. Old ways are forgotten. The practice of arms is forbidden. Minipins have grown soft and foolish and dangerously complacent. Even the sacred secret of the swords is scoffed at as an elven tale not to be believed. Be it noted that I dutifully offered the contents of these chests to the new Mayor Litted for the museum now a building, but his reply was that nobody is interested in the dead past. Lest these precious relics fall into disrespectful hands, I enclose them in this underground vault, with the exception of a few fragments of parchment. They give a hint of the treasures contained herein, and I leave them in the possession of my eldest son's family, in hopes that at some distant time another Walter the Earl, untainted by the fool's blood, will love the old ways enough to read the fragments and search until he unearths these treasures. It is my belief that such a one will appear when he is needed for the safety of his people. Let him believe in the swords and teach others to believe in their secret before it is too late. Signed by his hand, Walter the 17th Earl, sometimes known as Walter the Obtuse. There was silence in the dim vault, except for the crackle of the parchment in Walter the Earl's hands and the sputter of the candle. The sacred secret of the swords, Curly Green said at last. What can it mean? And what are swords? Walter the Earl shook his head. It is a lost word. But I wonder. He picked up the long black knife and examined it, turning it over and over in his hands. I feel the answer lies here, he said with a frown. Sword. Sword. Over and over he turned it, seeking out its secret, but the blade remained dull and heavy in his hand. Trumpet, said Muggle suddenly. That's what the horrid noise is. A trumpet, because it looks like a trumpet flower. Yes, oh yes, said Curly Green. How clever of you, Muggles. Now, what were those other things, Walter the Earl? The things he said were in the chest. Armor. Walter the Earl wrinkled his brow. Something to go on the arms? He tapped the metal guards on his own arms. Well, perhaps. A sudden loud pounding sound from above, and then the three froze in their places. Somebody was knocking at the door of Walter the Earl's house. The candle fell from Curly Green's hand and went out. There was a pause, and then the pounding recommenced. If it was the town clerk, or the mayor himself returned from Watersplash, the pounding stopped. Muggles scarcely breathed. The silence went on so long that Walter the Earl's metal suit gave a relieved squeak, and Curly Green bent over cautiously to search for the candle. But a new sound stiffened them. Little clods of dirt came filtering down the outside of the narrow opening of the vault. Somebody was standing on the top of the dirt pile. There was a slipping and a sliding, and the next moment, the light from the opening was blocked off. Muggles huddled inside the jeweled cloak to make herself look smaller, but she knew it was hopeless. Whoever was standing there would be standing inside in a moment, and the secret of the treasures would be discovered. Then a voice exclaimed, "Well, I'll be bound. He's underground. And what a pleasure. He's found the treasure." "Gummy!" Curly Green cried. "It's only Gummy." "At your service. Don't be nervous." The figure slipped through the aperture and made a low bow before them, sweeping off his tall conical hat. "Though what you meant by only Gummy, I can't imagine." As Curly Green lit the candle again, his eyes widened as he stared first at Walter the Earl's metal helmet, then at the three twinkling jeweled cloaks, and finally his gaze wandered over to the iron chests scattered about the chamber. He gave a low whistle and suddenly clasped himself in a delighted hug that sent his sun-yellow cloak flying. "Oh, joy, oh, joy, oh, joy!" he cried, and then his eyes flew wide in consternation. "Oh, my hat, oh, my shoe, oh, my nose and ear, you'd better find an exit quick. The town clerk's nearly here." Curly Green jumped up in alarm. "But the treasure—" Gummy nodded sadly. "Co's hoppin' mad. If we don't fill up that hole outside within 1 hour, he's going to put Walter the Earl out of his house. For good." "Then the treasure will be lost again," Muggles wrung her hands. "Oh, no, that's all right," said Walter the Earl. "We'll use the trap door." "Trap door?" They stared at him blankly. "Over there." Walter the Earl waved at the farthest corner. "I knew there must have been one. It was the first thing I looked for when I broke in." With a bound, Gummy was across the room and scaling the metal rungs of the ladder fastened against the wall. "You had better be careful," Walter the Earl warned. "I believe it opens into—" "Got it!" Gummy cried. He tugged at the latch in the ceiling and then stepped down a few rungs to let the trapdoor fall free. "Ugh!" he yelled as an avalanche of ashes cascaded over him. "Into my fireplace," Walter the Earl finished. That is the end of chapter 2. It is 9 o'clock. So that means that we are going to sign off here. And I will be back next week, same time, same place, to continue reading. I will post a link, same way I did today. I'll post a link on Facebook and on Instagram. And you can find the live stream on my channel. It should be public, should be accessible for everybody. Thank you guys so much for coming. I really appreciate it. I'm gonna go ahead and head out, and I will see everybody next week. Thank you. Bye.